Eric Sloane had always believed in quiet victories, the kind you didn't boast about but carried deep in your bones like an old tune that never left your mind. After 40 years working with his hands, shaping wood into elegant tables and cabinets for families he would never meet, he'd finally settled into what he thought would be the calmest chapter of his life. His home sat on the edge of a modest, slow-moving suburb, not far from a dried-up riverbed and an empty trail once used by hikers and their dogs. He chose the place not for convenience or community, but for the simple reason that it gave him space to breathe, to work, and to be left alone. The neighbors were fine, mostly retired couples and second homeowners, the kind who waved but didn't ask questions. It suited him perfectly. The property had once belonged to his uncle, a hard-edged man who never married, and who spent his final years building a dense garden along the back edge of the lot. Eric inherited the house when the old man passed, along with the full deed, a weathered map of the property lines, and a notebook filled with gardening notes and half-sketched woodworking ideas. He hadn't intended to stay, but when he arrived to clear it out, the house greeted him with a kind of stubborn comfort he hadn't known he'd been missing. A few repairs, some insulation, a refinished floor, and the place slowly turned into a sanctuary. He let his old shop lease expire, brought his tools into the large back shed, and started taking orders from a small website his nephew had set up. The money wasn't flashy, but he didn't need flashy. He needed quiet. And he had it, until Karen Blake decided he didn't. Karen lived 2 houses down, in a broad, cream-colored single-story that looked more like a corporate office than a home. Her yard was artificial turf. Her mailbox had a surveillance sticker on it despite not being hooked to any system, and she ran the local neighborhood committee with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She knocked on Eric's door within a week of him moving in, and presented him with a glossy pamphlet outlining community expectations. He had thanked her, placed it in a drawer, and never looked at it again. Karen, apparently, had not forgotten. What started as mild tension escalated slowly but with a steady rhythm. It began with passive-aggressive flyers about lawn maintenance, continued with complaints about his delivery trucks being too large for neighborhood aesthetics, and eventually evolved into formal letters from the neighborhood council claiming that his shed violated the setback rule. Eric responded with patience and paperwork. He proved the shed had existed for over a decade before he'd arrived, that it was not in violation of any actual municipal code, and that any enforcement would have to come through the city, not Karen's self-appointed board. That's when the land dispute began. The issue centered on a 30-foot stretch of earth at the rear of Eric's property, a sloped patch leading to a dry stream lined with cottonwoods and wild grass. Karen claimed it was community land, that it had been donated by the previous owner and now belonged to the neighborhood for future use as a garden or walking path. Eric had the paperwork to prove otherwise, a deed with clear boundary lines, an old surveyor's certificate from the 1980s, and a more recent digital survey confirming the measurements. None of it mattered to Karen. She was a woman who had never encountered a no she couldn't override with paperwork, complaints, or political pressure. She filed a civil suit against Eric, demanding the land be turned over to the neighborhood and threatening damages if he refused. Eric hired a lawyer, not because he feared the outcome, but because he knew better than to underestimate people like Karen, the kind who operated not through strength but through relentless attrition, who didn't stop when they were wrong but simply changed their angle of attack. The proceedings dragged on for 7 months. Karen spoke of community benefit and prior verbal agreements. She brought forward a blurry photograph of what she claimed was her dog playing on the disputed land 5 years ago. Eric's lawyer calmly dismantled every argument with documents, dated aerial photos, and statements from previous property owners who had nothing kind to say about Karen's version of the truth. When the final hearing arrived, the courtroom felt more like a town hall debate than a legal proceeding. Karen wore a bright floral blouse and clutched a manila folder filled with handwritten notes. Eric sat beside his attorney, silent and focused, his hands folded loosely in his lap. The judge took less than an hour to rule. The land belonged to Eric. There had been no donation, no implied transfer, no shared easement. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. Karen was ordered to pay Eric's legal fees. The gavel hit the wood like a thunderclap, and for a brief moment it felt like justice had won. But then Karen turned. Her face caught in a twitch of disbelief and rage, and said just loud enough for those near the front to hear, "This isn't over." She didn't shout, didn't cause a scene, but the quiet venom in her tone made Eric's stomach tighten in a way he didn't like. It was the voice of someone who'd lost control of something she believed was hers by right. And people like that didn't just walk away. They schemed. Eric tried to move on. He replaced his damaged fence, cleaned up the yard, and spent more time in the workshop, shaping walnut and oak as a way to settle his mind. He assumed that Karen would lash out with more flyers, maybe try to appeal the ruling in some desperate way, or stir up new complaints about noise or traffic. What he didn't expect was the knock on his door at 5:36 a.m., just 6 days after the ruling. Not a polite knock, not the kind that precedes a conversation, but the kind that comes from a fist or a boot. It was followed by voices, shouting, urgent commands, boots on gravel. Eric barely had time to reach the hallway when the door burst open. Flashlights, muzzle beams, tactical vests. It wasn't some prank or overzealous code inspector. It was a tactical police team, and they were screaming for him to get on the ground. He complied, slowly and deliberately, speaking clearly with every movement. He had no weapons in the house, no criminal record, nothing that could justify this level of force. But the men didn't care. They followed their training, cleared each room, zip-tied his wrists, and escorted him out into the cold morning air. His neighbors watched from their porches, wrapped in robes and blankets, their eyes wide and whispering. Karen stood among them, one hand covering her mouth in performative shock, the other holding her phone. He sat on the curb for nearly an hour before anyone spoke to him beyond barked instructions. When the ranking officer finally approached, his tone had changed. Something wasn't right. The threat level had dropped. They were starting to realize there was no bomb, no arsenal, no barricade. Just a quiet man in his early 60s, barefoot and stunned, trying to keep calm while strangers stormed his home. The officer asked questions, mostly procedural. Then came the revelation. Someone had called in a threat under Eric's name, claiming he was planning a violent act in retaliation for losing a court case. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so terrifying. Eric was released after being questioned for most of the day. No charges were filed. No apology was offered. He returned to a home with broken hinges, scattered tools, and neighbors who now looked at him with quiet suspicion. He didn't know how Karen had done it or who she'd used to make the call, but one thing became immediately clear. She had lost in court, and now she was playing a different game. One where rules didn't matter and destruction wasn't just collateral, it was the goal. And Eric understood, perhaps for the first time, that he was no longer dealing with a neighbor in conflict. He was dealing with a person who had declared war. In the aftermath of the SWAT raid, Eric Sloan found himself locked in a strange kind of paralysis. Not the kind where fear freezes your body, but the deeper, slower kind. The one that sets in when you realize the people who are supposed to protect you have already stormed your house, rifled through your belongings, and left you alone with a door that no longer closed properly and a name that now carried suspicion. That morning, he had walked barefoot across shards of his own picture frames, stepped over drawers emptied onto the floor, and stood silently in the middle of his kitchen staring at the overturned table as if waiting for something else to collapse. He didn't call anyone. He didn't clean. He just sat at the edge of the bed until the sun came through the slats and started burning his skin, and only then did he move. Slow, deliberate, as if gravity had tripled overnight. By the time the dust settled and he began to piece together what had happened, Eric was already 3 steps behind. The official line was that someone had phoned in a report claiming he'd made threats. Serious ones, the kind that trigger an automatic response from tactical units. The call came from a prepaid phone with a dead SIM. The voice on the recording wasn't recognizable. The report claimed that Eric had boasted about wiring his shed with explosives and preparing retribution for what he believed was an unjust verdict. That was the wording they used. Retribution. He'd heard it from the officer who interviewed him after the search, the one who offered him a coffee and pretended he hadn't just watched him zip-tied in his own living room. Eric had asked if they had any verification, any reason to believe the call was credible, and the officer had simply shrugged and said, "We can't afford to take chances." The implication was clear. It wasn't about whether Eric had done anything. It was about the possibility that he might, and that a possibility had been handed to law enforcement with just enough detail to sound real and just enough vagueness to avoid immediate dismissal. The caller knew the layout of his property. They knew about the old shed. They knew that Eric had once talked about how fragile property rights had become, something he'd mentioned in passing during the court case. Nothing violent, nothing extreme, just an old man voicing his frustration. But that comment had made it into the report, almost word for word. Someone had been listening. Someone had been paying attention. For the next week, Eric did what he could to stabilize the wreckage. He had his attorney file a complaint not out of hope that it would go anywhere, but to create a paper trail in case things escalated further. He paid out of pocket to have the front door replaced and the shed locks changed. He began scanning for recording devices, even though it made him feel ridiculous, and installed a new motion camera above the back porch. It wasn't paranoia, it was defense. You don't get kicked in the teeth and then ask if the boot was polished. You start wearing a helmet. What unsettled him most wasn't the raid itself, or the damage, or even the humiliation. It was the silence that followed. Karen Blake didn't gloat. She didn't stop by his house or send him another letter or post anything inflammatory on the community board. She just disappeared from the narrative, as if her role had concluded and she was watching from behind some unseen curtain. That quiet, unnerved Eric more than anything. He'd expected noise, accusations, meetings, maybe even a renewed attempt to reclaim the land. But what he got instead was a vacuum. A neighbor who had once made herself known every week had suddenly gone completely still, like the surface of a pond right before something massive rises from below. On the 8th day after the raid, Eric found a sealed manila envelope in his mailbox. No return address, no stamps, just his name in printed letters, carefully typed and taped in the center. Inside were 5 printed photographs. The first was of his shed, taken from behind his fence. The second showed his workbench inside the shed, zoomed in through the window. The third was of him kneeling in the yard, repairing one of the panels on the garden bed. The fourth was a screenshot of his listing on the state business license directory, with a red circle drawn around the address. The last photo was different. It was a picture of a printed newspaper headline from 1996, an article about a warehouse fire downtown, one Eric barely remembered, except that he'd done some minor repairs in that building months before the fire occurred. Someone had dug through decades of history to pull something meaningless from the dirt. The message was clear. We know everything. Eric brought the envelope inside and didn't say a word for the rest of the day. He didn't call the police. He didn't scan the neighborhood for cameras. Instead, he went to the fridge, poured himself a glass of water, and stared at the 5 photos for an hour. The implication wasn't that they'd found anything damning. There was nothing to find. It was that they wanted him to believe they could, if they looked hard enough, that his life wasn't a home anymore, but an open folder. 2 days later, a city code enforcement officer showed up unannounced. She was polite but firm, asking to inspect his property based on an anonymous tip about illegal chemical storage. Eric let her in. She found nothing. She wrote a report that clearly stated the claim was baseless. But the interaction still rattled him. Not because of what she said, but because she knew exactly where to look. She walked straight to the shed. She inspected the drawers where he kept his solvents, even opened the cabinet that he usually kept locked, and only shrugged when he asked how she'd known what to check. "The tip was very specific," she replied. The following night, the motion camera on the back porch triggered 3 times in the span of 20 minutes. The footage showed nothing but faint movement, branches swaying, shadows that didn't line up with the trees. Eric reviewed it 6 times, frame by frame. One of the shadows paused for a moment just beyond the fence line. He couldn't make out a face, but the outline of a shoulder, the turn of a head. It was someone. Watching. Waiting. It was around then that Eric realized the real attack had never been the SWAT raid. That had just been the opening act. The real campaign was this slow, corrosive pressure applied in layers, the fear that your home is compromised, the uncertainty of who's watching, the knowledge that the law will always arrive late and leave early. It wasn't about getting him arrested or evicted. It was about wearing him down until he made a mistake, until he lashed out, until he snapped and gave them something real to use against him. So, he didn't snap. He made calls, quiet ones, not to friends, not to family. He reached out to a former legal contact who specialized in harassment law. He hired a private security consultant, the kind who didn't wear a uniform and didn't advertise his services. He told them everything. Every photograph, every strange knock on the door, every passing car that lingered too long in the cul-de-sac. He documented every incident, stored it on an encrypted drive, and sent copies to 2 people he trusted, just in case anything ever happened to him. But even as he acted methodically, carefully, Eric felt the line stretching thinner. He'd always believed that being right meant being safe. Now he knew better. Being right just made you a bigger target, especially when someone like Karen had lost her grip on the one thing she couldn't control through policy or paperwork, his refusal to fold. And somewhere in the back of his mind a question had begun to form, not sharp or urgent, but slow and invasive like water soaking into drywall. If she was willing to do this after losing a land dispute, what would she do if she thought she could win? Something worse. The following days unfolded with the kind of quiet, meticulous menace that made Eric question every sound he heard at night and every shape he saw in his periphery. He stopped using the front door, opting instead to come and go through the side gate, which was hidden behind a line of overgrown hedges. It wasn't fear that guided his choices. It was preservation. There was a distinct difference, and men like Eric, who'd lived long enough to know the cost of every misstep, understood it better than most. When an enemy is subtle, patient, and enjoys watching you squirm, the worst thing you can do is give them confirmation that they've rattled you. So Eric played the long game, just as he suspected Karen was doing. The private consultant he'd hired, name omitted, cash payment only, showed up 3 days later in an unmarked truck with tinted windows and a military bearing Eric recognized immediately. No questions about what happened. Just a handshake, a clipboard, and a brief walk around the property. Within 48 hours, the shed had a second layer of locking mechanisms. 3 new cameras covered all angles of the backyard, and a portable signal scanner was quietly monitoring for wireless frequencies inside a 20-meter radius. The consultant didn't say much, but on the 3rd day, while checking the device logs, he muttered something that stuck in Eric's mind. Someone's using a relay burst every other night, late, not long enough to pinpoint. Just enough to tap something. Eric didn't need clarification. Someone wasn't just watching from outside. They were likely accessing something, somewhere, that had been physically compromised. It could have been a planted sensor, a modified device, or something buried. The point wasn't what, it was the pattern. Someone was pressing, testing, and adjusting, just like a siege. A cold, modern siege designed to keep him isolated, exhausted, and vulnerable. There were no flaming arrows, no battering rams, just silence, technology, and the ever-present implication that he was no longer alone on his own land. The lawyer he'd retained wasn't the kind that smiled or offered platitudes. She worked out of a one-room office, had a calendar full of color-coded sticky notes, and answered every question like she was preparing for cross-examination. Her name was Danny Heller, and she didn't believe in coincidences. When Eric gave her the timeline, SWAT raid, untraceable envelope, targeted inspection, she didn't blink. She simply asked for names, dates, and recordings. Then she pulled up the city's property zoning system and found something that made Eric's skin crawl. A permit request had been submitted the week after the court ruling to reevaluate his back parcel for community repurposing. The application wasn't signed by Karen, but by a nonprofit she had publicly endorsed in the past, one with no employees, no phone number, and a mailing address that redirected to a private mailbox suite in another city. It was a shell, and someone had activated it. Danny filed an immediate injunction to block any municipal movement related to Eric's property. At the same time, she requested full records of who had accessed Eric's public files in the zoning office and any digital requests made under his address. The list that came back included a name that stood out instantly: Blake Carter, Karen's husband, retired civil engineer, low profile, rarely seen around the neighborhood. Eric had met him once, months ago, when the man stood quietly in the background while Karen dropped off one of her regulation packets. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't even looked Eric in the eye. But now, his name was tied to every quiet bureaucratic maneuver made since the court case ended. Things escalated the next evening when Eric returned from a supply run and noticed the side panel on his workshop door had been removed. Not forced, not broken. Unscrewed. Carefully. Intentionally. The screws were stacked on the windowsill in a neat little pile as if someone had wanted him to notice but not panic. Nothing was taken. Nothing was out of place. But the message was as deliberate as it was infuriating. We can come and go. You are not safe. We choose not to destroy, yet. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the shed with the lights off, a heavy wrench in his lap, and his phone face down beside him. Around 3:42 a.m., the motion camera triggered. He checked the live feed and saw nothing. But when he went outside at sunrise, there was a small patch of earth in the back corner that had been disturbed. Fresh soil, no prints, no tool marks, just a 6-inch wide circle of upturned ground. He didn't dig it up. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction. Instead, he marked the spot with chalk, then placed a 5-gallon bucket of gravel over it. The next morning, it was gone. Not the bucket, just the chalk. Danny told him to keep everything: notes, footage, timestamps. She began drafting a harassment claim but warned him that it would be difficult to prove unless something definitive occurred: an injury, property damage, a direct admission. They both knew that wouldn't happen. People like Karen didn't work in confessions. They worked in implications, in deniability, in layers of proxies and false fronts. But Danny had also filed a public records request for communications from the local community board. Emails, memos, minutes from meetings. What came back was enlightening. Karen had been building a quiet campaign long before the court ruling. She'd lobbied for new development restrictions, argued for mental wellness assessments for owners involved in disputes, and even proposed installing security watchtowers along the community's greenbelt, which, not coincidentally, ran along Eric's back property line. Most of the motions were struck down, but the effort was there. She had been positioning him as a problem long before she lost. The final straw came that Friday. Eric went to pick up a package from the local post office and was told there was a note on his box. When the clerk handed it to him, it wasn't the usual slip. It was a typed letter on city letterhead, except it wasn't official. The seal was wrong. The margins were off, and the signature at the bottom belonged to someone who'd retired last year. It claimed his address had been flagged for further review under safety codes 24B and 27E, codes which, when Danny later checked, didn't exist. It was a fake. Someone had gone to the trouble of fabricating an official-looking notice and inserting it into a federal building. That took nerve, or access. Eric stared at the paper in his car for a long time, the words swimming as his grip tightened. This wasn't about land anymore. This wasn't about some 30-foot strip of wild grass behind his fence. This was personal. This was war of attrition from someone who had resources, connections, and no shame. Someone who was willing to chip away at his sanity, one fabricated document and open panel at a time. That night, he packed a small duffel and drove 2 towns over to stay at a motel under a different name. He needed distance, not because he was scared, but because he knew that he was being pushed toward something dangerous, toward anger, paranoia, rash decisions, and if he gave in, even once, he'd lose the one thing Karen had never been able to take from him, his control. He stayed gone for 48 hours. When he returned, nothing looked out of place, but in his mailbox was a single item, a white card with 3 words typed in the center. "We missed you." No envelope, no return address, just the unspoken promise that this wasn't over, and that next time they might not wait for him to leave. Eric returned to his house with a strange stillness in his chest, not the calm of resolution, but the deceptive quiet that settles after a near miss, the kind that pretends everything is normal even when you know the next blow is coming. The card in the mailbox, printed with those cold, anonymous words, "We missed you," had done something none of the other provocations had managed. It made Eric feel, for a brief moment, not just watched, but hunted. It was the kind of detail someone leaves when they've had time, access, and the full knowledge that the person they're targeting won't run to the police because the story sounds too unbelievable to be real. The next morning, he changed the locks again, not just on the house, but on the shed and the fuse box and even the water shutoff valve behind the side gate. He began checking his security camera feeds not once, but 3 or 4 times a day. He kept backups in 2 separate locations and made sure the consultant he'd hired was still running the signal scans. The consultant, without prompting, told Eric that someone had attempted a signal spike near his garage. Nothing sustained, nothing traceable, but enough to suggest someone was still probing. Danny, meanwhile, was pushing harder through legal channels. Her public records requests began uncovering small but pointed anomalies. Complaints about Eric's property submitted under multiple names, all of which were real residents who denied having filed anything. An email thread in which a neighborhood association member, whose identity was partially redacted, openly questioned whether escalation might be necessary to preserve the safety and perception of their block. The term escalation wasn't defined. Danny sent the thread directly to Eric with no commentary. It didn't need any. He read the word 6 times. Escalation. The worst part wasn't the threat. It was the suggestion that the neighborhood itself, the people who lived on his street, who waved at him while walking their dogs, who once asked him for help moving a fence post, had now potentially become part of the background noise supporting Karen's private war. That illusion broke completely one evening just before dusk, when Eric stepped outside to lock the shed and saw someone standing on the sidewalk, looking directly at the house. Not moving, not taking photos, just standing. Middle-aged man, clean-shaven, baseball cap pulled low. The way he stood wasn't casual. It was intentional, his hands in his pockets, feet planted. Eric stared at him for a few seconds, waiting for some gesture, some acknowledgement, but the man never moved. Finally, Eric stepped forward and called out, "Need something?" And only then did the figure break his stance, turn and walk away without a word, disappearing behind the corner of Karen's yard. Eric didn't follow. He didn't take a photo. He didn't even tell Danny right away. What was he supposed to say? That a man stood in front of his house for 60 seconds without speaking and it felt like surveillance? That his gut told him that whoever it was, they weren't a delivery driver or a lost tourist, but a message on 2 feet? A week later, the private consultant left a typed summary of recent activity on Eric's property. He flagged something new, evidence of a signal bridge being used in close proximity to the house, possibly from inside a nearby vehicle. It wasn't a continuous feed. More likely, it was a time-stamped burst, piggybacking on Eric's own Wi-Fi or the camera network, long enough to download a packet of information or trigger an automated response. The consultant couldn't confirm the source, but he highlighted the likelihood that Eric's systems had been temporarily hijacked. A few seconds here or there, barely detectable, but enough to extract data or inject something dangerous. That same afternoon, Danny called with news that the non-profit behind the renewed zoning petition, the one linked to Karen through a web of shell names, had filed an injunction against the injunction. A rare maneuver, technically legal but usually reserved for aggressive corporate cases. It was intended to reopen the conversation about Eric's back parcel, to force the city to reassess the decision, and to require him to defend his property all over again in front of a board that had already shown it was easily manipulated. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It was a pressure tactic, a new front in the same war. What changed everything was what happened the next morning. Eric walked out to the mailbox and found it empty. Not unusual, except that the door had been left ajar and a smear of grease marked the inside handle. On a hunch, he pulled the whole box out of its mounting and turned it over. Taped to the underside, tucked between the base and the pole, was a small plastic container, no bigger than a battery pack. It wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a tracker. It was a modified RFID beacon, similar to those used in building security systems or delivery routing. He didn't touch it. He called the consultant, who confirmed it was low energy but had likely been active for weeks, piggybacking off local networks and emitting pulses when triggered remotely. Whoever planted it had access to his mailbox. They'd been within feet of his front door more than once. The beacon made things real in a way the other events hadn't, because while it didn't carry a camera or explosive, it proved one undeniable fact. Someone had stepped onto his property, undetected, and had done so with a level of precision that suggested experience. Not a neighbor with a grudge. Not a bored teenager. This was someone with practice. That night, Danny called him to say the zoning office had received another batch of public complaints about his parcel. Identical wording, different senders. Eric asked her to read them. The language was professional. Terms like threat vector, non-compliant land utilization, and emergency policy activation stood out. These weren't the words of angry neighbors. They were written like position papers. And they didn't just paint Eric as a nuisance. They framed him as a potential destabilizer, a wild card element that might need to be reconsidered. That word, reconsidered, sat with him like a splinter under the skin. He barely slept. He stopped using his workshop entirely, instead working on a folding table in the garage with the door half closed. When he went out for groceries, he parked further away and walked a longer path home, changing his routine. He kept his phone powered down unless he needed to make a call. And then, one evening, he found the motion camera at the back of the house had been repositioned, only by a few inches, but just enough to leave a blind spot. When he checked the log, the timestamp showed a 2-minute blackout exactly 12 hours earlier. No storm, no power surge, just a gap. When he mentioned it to the consultant, the man was quiet for a few seconds, then simply said, "You're not imagining this. They're not done. They're probing for a threshold." Eric didn't need to ask what that meant. It was the same thing he'd begun to feel in his bones, that Karen, or the network around her, was pushing for a tipping point. A moment when the system would stop asking questions and start taking actions. They weren't just trying to force him out. They were trying to make him the one who lit the match. And if they could goad him into it, into a mistake, into something they could call a threat or an act of aggression, then everything else would fall into place. And the worst part was, deep down, Eric could feel that they were close. The day unfolded under an uneasy stillness, the kind that didn't feel peaceful but rather calculated. No letters, no knocks, no flickers on the camera feeds. Nothing. The quiet wasn't soothing. It was suspicious. Eric had lived through enough now to recognize that a lull in pressure didn't mean the campaign against him had ended. It meant a new phase was beginning. He checked every lock twice, then a third time, ran his fingertip along the screws of the window frames, pressed lightly on the floorboards beneath the kitchen cabinets in case someone had crept in and left something behind. The private consultant's scan log showed minor irregularities, but nothing that screamed intrusion. Still, Eric could feel the shift, like the scent of metal in the air before a storm that hasn't yet cracked the sky. Danny called with news that landed like a dull blade. The city had reopened discussions about the parcel of land behind his house. The original denial had been overturned. An appeal had been filed through a non-profit entity, one he knew to be a shell, citing vague language about community stability and land underutilization. 3 signatures were attached to the submission. When he confronted one of the named neighbors, a man he'd once lent tools to, the response was confused and nervous. The neighbor claimed he had signed a form related to tree planting. Nothing else. Danny suspected forged consent. Proving that would take time, analysis, money, and city cooperation. Eric knew better than to count on any of those. That same day, he walked to his shed and found the side panel removed. No damage, no debris. The screws had been carefully unscrewed and stacked in a neat pile on the windowsill, as if whoever did it wanted him to know that they had access, not to take anything, but to declare that they could. Nothing was missing, but everything had changed. That evening, as he inspected the yard with a flashlight, he noticed a section of dirt at the far end that had clearly been disturbed. The top layer had been replaced carefully, but not perfectly. A bucket he'd placed nearby the day before had been turned. Not moved, just rotated 90 degrees. Someone had been there again, this time walking the back boundary. Eric didn't dig the patch. Instead, he marked it with a stake and walked away. The next day, the stake was gone. Danny began assembling a new set of filings: coordinated harassment, possible forgery, unlawful attempts to rezone private land under false pretenses. But even her usually steady voice had started to carry an edge of unease. When Eric mentioned seeing a man watching from the sidewalk, she didn't suggest reporting it. She suggested documenting it in writing and saving a printed copy in a locked drawer. That's how thin the walls had become. He received a letter from the fire department claiming that someone had reported hazardous materials being stored in his workshop. They conducted a visit. He let them in, showed everything: properly labeled finishes, ventilation, safety locks. The inspector was civil but firm, said they had to log the visit. A week later, a red flag appeared next to his address on the city's public database. It wasn't a violation, just a mark. Public, subtle, but real. Another layer of implication, painted quietly for others to discover and assume the worst. More letters arrived, some physical, some electronic. One came from a legal service he'd never contacted, offering conflict resolution and suggesting he consider mediation before neighborhood tensions escalated further. The language was sterile, but the meaning was clear. Surrender, step back, concede. The land. There was never a demand, only suggestion, wrapped in polite words like de-escalation and harmony. Karen's name never appeared, but her fingerprints were on every document. Eric ignored the offers, though the pressure they applied wasn't lost on him. A complaint was filed against his business license, accusing him of producing unregistered goods, storing volatile chemicals, and operating outside zoning limits. No evidence was attached. Still, the mere existence of the complaint triggered a formal review process, meaning investigators could visit, search, interview. The more smoke they created, the more people would assume fire, regardless of the facts. He wasn't just being pushed. He was being reshaped in the public record into a problem, into someone unstable, someone whose presence in the neighborhood needed to be reconsidered. That word came back to him through a second-hand email chain, intercepted and forwarded by Danny, where a member of the neighborhood group had floated the suggestion that certain properties might require administrative review for mental wellness alignment. It was phrased as a safety concern, but Eric knew what it meant. It meant they were working on ways to get him out not through laws or sales, but through labeling. Strip his credibility, question his behavior, redefine him on paper until he no longer looked like a neighbor but a liability. He barely spoke to anyone at that point. A few neighbors averted their eyes when he passed. One, who used to bring over baked bread during the holidays, crossed the street with her dog when she saw him in the yard. The damage wasn't just procedural, it was cultural. The sense of community, however superficial it had once been, had collapsed into cautious glances and silence. The cameras picked up movement in his yard again, not on the paths, but in the corners, the blind spots. One was moved slightly. Another had its lens brushed with something sticky and dark, like tree sap, distorting the image. A wire near the garage had been cleanly snipped. No break-in followed. Nothing was stolen. It wasn't burglary. It was a message. We can touch your systems. We can blind you, even briefly. You're vulnerable where it matters most. The consultant recommended he vacate for a while, take a few days, clear his head. But Eric refused. To leave now would affirm everything they were trying to paint, that he was unstable, unpredictable, the kind of man who disappeared without warning. They weren't just after his house, they were after his definition, and he wouldn't hand it over. He stayed. And then came the photograph. It was in the mailbox beneath a folded ad flyer, no envelope, no signature. It showed the side of his house at night, and in the window, faintly illuminated, was his own silhouette standing in his bedroom. The photo was grainy but unmistakable. Someone had taken it from a distance, from the street, from a position that required timing, knowledge, and boldness. He held the image for a long time, staring at the version of himself frozen in the frame, alone, unaware, visible. The photo wasn't just invasive, it was precise. It told him that they knew his schedule, his habits, his presence. They didn't have to enter any more. They just had to remind him they were always there, outside, watching, waiting. And the worst part was, he could feel it working. The air around the house had changed. It wasn't visible, wasn't measurable, but Eric felt it the same way you feel the electricity in the air before lightning hits, the quiet crackle beneath your skin that tells you something final is coming. The pattern of the last few weeks, surveillance, intrusions, legal maneuvers, fabricated complaints had begun to converge, no longer scattered but layered, coordinated, moving toward something singular. He didn't know what the end game was, not entirely, but the pressure was now constant, not in waves, but in one sustained grip. He could feel it in the way his phone rang with unknown numbers only to fall silent the moment he answered, in the way his internet connection slowed at odd hours as if someone else were siphoning from the signal, in the way that even sleep now came. Only in short fragments, and when it did, it brought dreams that left him tense and disoriented, as though he were waking in a place that didn't quite belong to him anymore. The moment of break came as such things often do, not with an explosion but a knock. Not a pounding, not an assault, just a knock. Calm, deliberate, spaced. Not on the front door, but on the garage side entrance. A door only a few people even knew existed, used rarely, and never advertised. When Eric opened it, he didn't speak. He didn't ask why the man standing there had no uniform, no badge, only a laminated ID clipped to his coat with a city agency name that seemed off. Not quite wrong, but slightly incorrect, like a forgery made by someone who had almost done their homework. The man spoke quietly, authoritatively, asking to conduct an inspection related to a new complaint filed with the Environmental Safety Division regarding improper drainage systems that were allegedly affecting the greenbelt behind Eric's house. When Eric asked for paperwork, the man paused for half a second too long before handing over a folded document that looked legitimate from a distance but lacked an official seal, bore no case number, and included an address in the letterhead that didn't exist. It wasn't laziness, it was confidence. Confidence that Eric would be too tired, too eroded by weeks of harassment to question anything anymore. Eric stared at the man, then at the paper, and stepped back without a word, closing the door slowly and locking it behind him. He didn't call the police. He called Danny. Then he went into the kitchen, opened the drawer beside the fridge, and removed the small black plastic case he hadn't touched since he'd moved in. Inside were printed photos of every prior intrusion, reports from the consultant, copies of forged signatures, and now this new document. Danny arrived an hour later, and after inspecting the supposed permit, said only 2 words. "It's staged." That night, Eric stayed awake, not because he wanted to keep watch, but because he no longer believed he could afford the illusion of security sleep pretended to offer. When the break-in finally came, it wasn't in the form of a burglary or vandalism. It was quieter than that, more surgical. Eric had stepped out briefly to retrieve a delivery that had been dropped at the end of the driveway, a new shipment of wood oil for his workbench. He'd been gone no more than 15 minutes. When he returned, nothing appeared disturbed. No locks were broken, no windows shattered. But when he stepped into the workshop, the lights flickered, not out, not off, just flickered, like someone had tampered with the line. The smell was wrong, too. Not smoke, not chemical, but sterile, like plastic heated in a microwave. On instinct, he walked to the back cabinet, one he rarely opened, and found the contents disturbed. Tools moved, boxes opened. In the center of the floor, beneath the table, he spotted it. A small disc, no wider than a coin, with a blinking red light. He didn't touch it, he photographed it. Then he called the consultant, who confirmed later that evening that it was a transmitter, active, likely triggered by proximity, capable of initiating remote responses or sending location data to a paired device. Danny took the photo and said it was enough they had to act. Not defensively, not reactively, but proactively. She filed a criminal complaint with the district attorney, including documentation of the forged zoning documents, false city inspections, coordinated harassment, the planted transmitter, and the pattern of escalating intrusions. She also filed a motion to freeze any further administrative action against Eric's property until the criminal investigation concluded. The motion passed within 2 days. It was the first real institutional protection Eric had received since the nightmare began, and even then, it felt fragile, like it might dissolve if he exhaled too hard. But it wasn't over. That same week, he received a subpoena, not for court, for deposition. The nonprofit connected to the zoning appeal was now accusing him of hostile interference, claiming he had made threats against members of their board, citing a recorded statement and multiple eyewitnesses. No such recording was ever produced, but the accusation itself had power. It forced him into legal posture again, forced him to sit across from people he had never met, to answer questions delivered in neutral tones with loaded meanings. It forced him to defend his right not just to own land, but to live on it. The turning point came from a source neither he nor Danny had anticipated. A staff member from the city's building department, mid-level, anonymous, probably tired of being used, leaked a document showing that several of the fake inspection visits to Eric's home had been approved by internal override codes linked to a retired employee's login credentials. The override granted access to permit databases, scheduling systems, and even internal communications. The login had been used multiple times in recent months, always late at night, always from the same IP range tied to a private service provider registered under Karen Blake's husband's business name. When Danny confronted the city attorney with this information, the response was subdued and terse, followed 2 days later by a call from a senior compliance officer offering to resolve the situation internally, asking if Eric might consider voluntarily partitioning a portion of the land to ease tensions and bring closure. It was not phrased as coercion. It didn't have to be. The message was clear. Eric refused. The line had already been crossed. Giving an inch now would only validate everything they had done. Every lie, every forged document, every planted device and staged intrusion. He told Danny they would pursue the case to its end, no matter how long it took. She nodded, quietly, and said she'd already begun drafting the next phase. Outside, lights turned off one by one across the neighborhood. The stillness returned, but this time it wasn't his. It belonged to someone else. Someone waiting, watching, knowing that the next move would no longer be theirs to control. And for the first time, Eric didn't feel surrounded. He felt armed. The weeks that followed unfolded like the slow descent of heavy rain after a storm that had torn through everything. There were no more knocks, no more letters tucked beneath the mail, no shadows pacing the sidewalk under cover of night. The silence that settled wasn't ominous this time. It was the silence of retreat, the quiet that lingers when the aggressor realizes the game has gone too far, that the prey they were cornering has grown teeth and stopped backing down. Eric didn't declare victory. He didn't feel victorious. What he felt was the kind of steadiness that comes only after enduring the full measure of someone's malice and remaining intact, not untouched, but unbroken. The case moved forward. The criminal complaint gained momentum. The district attorney's office requested internal reviews of the permit system. The override code linked to Karen's household turned out to have been used dozens of times in unrelated zoning cases, enough to open a wider inquiry. The documents Danny compiled were now part of a growing file that reached several departments, and although no formal charges had yet been filed against Karen herself, her name began appearing in memos, in meeting transcripts, in footnotes that previously ignored her entirely. She didn't disappear overnight, but the network she had relied on, the faceless machinery of manipulation that had allowed her to operate in the shadows, began to collapse under scrutiny. It started subtly. The nonprofit she had used to push her appeals was disqualified from municipal grants. The petition to repurpose Eric's land was dismissed with prejudice, barring it from ever being filed again under the same zoning category. A memo circulated internally at City Hall advising caution around administrative code requests linked to her address. The quiet unraveling of her influence was slow but undeniable, and the neighborhood began to notice. Her porch, once a hub of social activity with potted plants arranged with surgical precision, now stood bare. The flags were gone, the curtains drawn. A for sale sign appeared in her yard one morning without fanfare. No open house, no announcement, just the plain declaration that her chapter here was ending. Eric stood at his window and watched a couple in matching windbreakers walk the perimeter with a realtor. No one came to introduce themselves. No one rang his bell. They took their photos and left. Eric didn't celebrate. He didn't share the news with friends or post about it in the online community boards. His victory, if it could be called that, wasn't the kind that demanded applause. It was the kind that required breathing room, reflection, and, most importantly, repair. The physical damage to his property was minimal compared to the psychological toll of weeks spent being targeted, undermined, surveilled. He went back to his workshop slowly, one tool at a time. The consultant helped sweep the house and shed again, confirmed the cameras and systems were clean, and quietly stepped away from the case, leaving Eric with a handshake and a card he hoped he'd never have to use again. Danny moved on to other clients but remained in touch, promising to keep a pressure on the administrative side until someone above Karen was forced to speak in front of a camera and admit what had been allowed to happen unchecked for so long. One day, without warning, Eric found a letter in his box. This one wasn't threatening. It was handwritten, sealed in a plain envelope, and signed only with the initials of a neighbor he barely knew. Inside was a simple sentence. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything." That was all. No explanation, no signature beyond the initials, but it landed harder than anything else, because it meant people had seen, they'd known, and they'd chosen silence until it was safe. Eric didn't blame them. That's how power worked. It didn't require loyalty, only passivity. And for a long time, Karen had used both expertly, but not anymore. He didn't rebuild the garden in the back. He let the grass grow taller than before, left the trees untouched, the soil uneven. He didn't mow in neat lines. He didn't landscape to appease. He simply let it be. Imperfect, wild, and defiantly his. The signs of surveillance were gone now. No more drive-bys. No more shadowy figures or anonymous letters. The cameras still rolled, but they captured birds, squirrels, and the occasional delivery driver who waved out of habit. The sense of siege had faded, replaced by something like resilience. Not confidence, not calm, but a kind of internal resolve that didn't require an audience. When Karen finally moved out, she didn't look in his direction. Her car pulled away mid-morning. A moving van followed hours later. The house stayed empty for weeks before a younger couple bought it. He never saw them speak with anyone else on the block. He never saw them step onto his property or glance toward his house with suspicion. They lived quietly. And that, to Eric, was more than enough. The case remained open. The city continued its reviews. There was no final press conference, no headline. But there was a note in a legal update several months later confirming the suspension of 2 administrative employees and an internal recommendation for reforms in the permitting system. It wasn't justice in the grand sense, but it was something, a correction, a course adjustment. The kind that didn't erase what had happened but acknowledged that it never should have. Eric kept working. He took fewer orders, spent more time in the woods behind his property, started sketching again, not furniture, but simple lines, shapes that meant nothing to anyone but him. He didn't talk about the experience. Not because he was afraid, because he'd said everything he needed to by standing his ground. His life hadn't been taken. His identity hadn't been rewritten. His home remained his. And sometimes that was enough. Not to win, but to endure, to exist, intact, after someone tried to erase you without ever touching you directly. On the fence at the back of his property, he nailed a small piece of cedar with words burned into it by hand. No message to the world. No threat. Just a marker that meant something to him and maybe to anyone else who ever tried to push him again. It read, "Still here."